Harlan Vickery didn't even knock. He pushed through the gate like he owned it, and the way he looked at her, the way his eyes moved from her face down to her body and back up again with that small, contemptuous smile, told Maren Whitlock everything she needed to know about what kind of conversation this was going to be. "You need to hear something true," he said, loud enough that the two men standing at his truck could hear every word. "A woman your size, alone out here, this land is going to eat you alive. Sell me the orchard parcel before spring and walk away with something. Because come August," he tilted his head toward the dead trees on the slope, "you'll be walking away with nothing." She was 29 years old, her husband had been buried 11 days, and Harlan Vickery was already measuring her failure. If that were you standing in that yard, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment right now and hit that subscribe button. Stories like Maren's are what this channel is built on, and I promise you do not want to miss what comes next. Hit the like button too, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Bracken Hollow, because what Harlan Vickery didn't know that morning, what nobody in that county knew, was that the woman standing in that yard had already made her decision, and it was going to change everything. The morning Maren's husband died, she had been outside mending a section of fence along the east pasture. She heard the screen door slam, not unusual, and then nothing. No footsteps. No voice calling her name. Just the wind moving through the dead apple trees on the southern slope, which had been producing nothing for 3 years and which her husband, Thomas, had spent the last summer of his life staring at with the particular kind of grief a farmer reserves for land that is failing beneath his hands. She found him on the kitchen floor. The paramedics were kind. The neighbors who brought food were kind. Even the men from the bank who showed up 2 weeks later with paperwork were, in their professional way, almost kind. But kindness was not what Maren needed. What she needed was a way to hold 200 acres together without the man who had spent 15 years learning how they worked. She was not a woman who had grown up farming. She had grown up in a small town 60 miles east, the daughter of a hardware store owner, and what she knew about land she had learned from Thomas in the years since they married, which meant she knew enough to understand how much she still didn't know. That was its own particular weight to carry, not ignorance exactly. More like incomplete knowledge, the kind that lets you see the problem clearly but not quite all the way to the solution. The farm was called Whitlock's Rest, though nobody in Bracken Hollow had ever used that name except Thomas, who had painted it on a board above the drive and been quietly proud of it for years. 200 acres of mixed land, some pasture, some timber, some garden rows that Maren kept herself, and the orchard. 41 apple trees on a south-facing slope, planted by Thomas's grandfather in varieties that nobody grew commercially anymore. They had been the heart of the farm's income for a generation, and for 3 years they had given almost nothing. Thomas had theories about why. Soil exhaustion, mostly. Maybe root disease in a few of the older trees. He had tried amendments, compost, a different irrigation line along the top of the slope. None of it had worked, and none of it had broken him exactly. But Maren had watched the orchard wear at him the way a slow leak wears at a foundation. Not all at once, but steadily, and always in the places you couldn't quite see. Now the orchard was her problem, and the debt was her problem, and the 200 acres and the equipment payments and the property taxes and the broken hydraulic line on the tractor and the 60-year-old barn roof that needed replacing. All of it was her problem, every morning before the sun was fully up, in a county that had already begun to quietly decide how her story was going to end. Harlan Vickery was the first person to say it out loud, but he was not the only one thinking it. She had known Harlan for years. He farmed the 2 parcels to her north and had been buying up surrounding land for over a decade, slowly and methodically, the way a man does when he is very patient and very certain of his own judgment. He was in his mid-60s, thick-shouldered, with a way of standing in any space that suggested he had already calculated his position in it. He had been friendly enough to Thomas. To Maren, he had always been polite in the specific way that communicates a clear ceiling on the respect being offered. When he walked through her gate 11 days after the funeral, Maren was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee she had not been able to drink because her stomach had been wrong for 2 weeks, and she couldn't seem to fix it. She was wearing her husband's flannel shirt over her own clothes because the morning was cold and because she had not yet been able to stop doing that. She was tired in a way that sleep wasn't fixing. She was, if she was honest with herself, frightened. Not of hard work, which she had never been afraid of, but of the particular mathematics of her situation, which were not currently adding up. Harlan's two men stayed by the truck. Harlan came to the porch steps and stopped. He said his piece about the orchard, about her size, about walking away with something versus walking away with nothing. He said it without cruelty, which was almost worse, the way a person states a fact they consider obvious and feel no particular satisfaction in being right about. Marin held her coffee cup with both hands. She looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate you coming by," she said. Harlan seemed to be waiting for her to say more. She didn't. He left. She poured the coffee off the porch railing and went inside to look at the numbers again. The numbers were not good. The equipment auction had brought in less than expected because March is not a good month for auctions, and because two of Thomas's machines needed mechanical work that the buyers had priced into their offers. The first creditor payment was due in 6 weeks. The property tax bill, which Thomas had deferred from the previous year, was due before summer. The orchard, her one meaningful asset beyond the land itself, had failed to produce anything worth selling for 37 consecutive months. She sat at the kitchen table for most of that afternoon with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil that kept running out of lead, and she worked through every reasonable scenario she could construct. Sell the orchard parcel to Harlan, which would solve the immediate debt problem, but leave her with a farm that had no productive center and a neighbor who would spend the next decade angling for the rest. Plant the cleared orchard land in corn, too late in the season, wrong soil profile, and she had no equipment to manage it. Take outside work. The nearest town with real employment was 40 miles away, and she had no one to watch the farm. Every path she could see led to the same place, a smaller farm or no farm at all, in less time than she wanted to accept. She was still sitting there when the sun went down. And then, at some point in the dark, she couldn't have said exactly when, she stopped looking at what she had and started thinking about what the problem actually was. The orchard was dying, not dead. She was careful about that distinction, even in her own thinking, because she had walked those rows enough times to know that dying and dead are not the same thing, even when they look identical from the road. Dying means something is still trying. Dying means the problem is the conditions, not the organism. And if the conditions were the problem, then the question wasn't whether to give up on the orchard. The question was whether the conditions could be changed. She had found the pamphlet 3 weeks earlier while she was sorting through a crate of Thomas's things from the barn. It was old, printed on paper that had yellowed at the edges and stapled in one corner that had mostly let go. The cover read, "Practical Methods for Orchard Restoration in Depleted Soils," and below that, a date from the 1940s. Thomas had written his name inside the front cover in pencil, the way he always marked things he wanted to read, which meant he had probably found it and set it aside and never gotten back to it. Marin read it twice that night, and then she sat with it. The pamphlet described an old practice, documented in several counties in the previous century apparently, in which farmers had used pigs to rehabilitate exhausted orchard land, not as a permanent arrangement, as a deliberate managed intervention. The animals' natural rooting behavior broke up compacted soil without mechanical disturbance. Their waste introduced nitrogen and organic material directly into the depleted root zone. Their foraging behavior cleaned out fallen fruit, fungal material, and pest populations that had been building for years in undisturbed ground. The pamphlet included hand-drawn diagrams and the accounts of 3 farmers who had documented significant recovery in their orchards after 2 to 3 seasons of managed pig rotation. It was not a guaranteed method. The pamphlet was clear about that. It required the right number of animals for the acreage, careful management of their movements, consistent monitoring of soil conditions, and a willingness to sustain the investment through at least one full growing cycle before expecting any visible result. Marin read it a 3rd time. Then she did what she always did when she was thinking seriously about something. She got up, put on her coat, and walked the orchard in the dark. She had done this enough times that she didn't need a flashlight on the familiar paths between the trees. She could feel the soil under her boots, where it was still hard and pale, where it had developed that shallow crust that meant the water wasn't penetrating, where the older roots had begun to surface because the ground beneath them wasn't giving anymore. She put her hand on the bark of the tree at the far end of the 2nd row, the one Thomas had called the old grandfather tree, and she stood there for a long time. She wasn't looking for a feeling. She wasn't looking for reassurance. She was looking at the problem the way she had learned from Thomas, practically, with her hands involved, without the comfort of pretending it was smaller than it was. What she decided, standing in the dark in the middle of a dying orchard, was this: the land wasn't finished. It was depleted. There was a difference, and she might be the only person in Bracken Hollow willing to act on that difference. The nearest livestock auction that handled the kind of animals she needed was 40 miles away, in a county seat called Deller. She drove there on a Thursday morning in early April in Thomas's truck, which needed an alignment she hadn't been able to afford yet, pulling slightly to the right the entire way. She had counted what she had in the farm account and what she could spend without falling below the minimum she needed to keep the utilities on and the feed bills current, and the number was not comfortable. It was the kind of number that makes your mouth go dry when you look at it. The auction house smelled the way all auction houses smell, like animal and sawdust and the specific nervousness of livestock that don't know where they are. She walked the pen slowly. She wasn't looking for the best animals. Best was not in her budget, and best was not, honestly, what her plan required. She was looking for animals in a specific condition, young enough to have full rooting instinct, small enough to be manageable in the number she needed, and, she was honest with herself about this, unwanted enough that she could afford 42 of them. She found them in the back pen. 42 piglets, the smallest in the sale, undersized and rough-coated in the way of animals that had not been getting adequate nutrition in their early weeks. The auctioneer had already moved past them twice without serious bids. The other farmers who had looked them over had moved on. One man in a green cap had looked at them, shaken his head, and said to his companion, loud enough for Marin to hear, "Runts, not worth the feed." Marin stood at the pen gate and looked at them for a long time. They were not impressive. They were bony in places, and their coats were uneven, and two of them had a minor eye discharge she would need to treat. But they were moving. They were rooting at the concrete floor of the pen with exactly the energy she needed them to apply to compacted orchard soil. Their instinct was intact. Their condition was correctable with better feed and management, and their price, when she finally got the auctioneer's attention and made her offer, was within the number she had written on the paper in her shirt pocket. She drove home with 42 piglets in a borrowed trailer, pulling right the entire way. When she turned off the county road and down her own drive, she passed two of her neighbors standing at a fence line. They watched the trailer. They watched her face through the truck window. She saw one of them say something to the other. She didn't stop. She had work to do. By the time she had gotten the piglets into the temporary pen, she had spent 3 days constructing along the orchard's edge, repurposing fencing materials she'd found in the barn, digging post holes herself in ground that was still half frozen, stringing wire until her hands were raw. It was past dark. She checked each animal by flashlight. She treated the two with the eye issue. She put down fresh bedding and set out feed and water. Then she sat on the fence rail and looked at them in the beam of the flashlight. 42 animals that nobody wanted, in an orchard nobody believed in, on a farm that everybody in the county had already begun to quietly write off. She was tired down to the marrow. Her back hurt. Her hands hurt. She had $340 in the farm account, and the first creditor payment was in 6 weeks, and she had not slept more than 4 hours in a single night since Thomas died. She sat on that rail for longer than she probably should have. Then she got down, shut the flashlight off, and went to make something to eat. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, she opened the gate and let the piglets into the orchard. She stood back and watched. The first one hesitated at the gate for exactly 3 seconds. Then it put its nose to the hard, pale ground and began to root. The others followed. Marin pulled her collar up against the cold and watched 42 unwanted animals begin the work that everyone in Bracken Hollow was absolutely certain was going to fail. She allowed herself exactly one thought before she went to start the rest of her morning. We'll see. The piglets had been in the orchard for 9 days when Harlan Vickery came back. This time, he didn't come alone. He brought Dale Pritchard, who farmed 300 acres south of the river, and whose opinion carried weight in Bracken Hollow the way certain men's opinions do. Not because he was always right, but because he spoke loudly and other people were tired of arguing with him. The two of them stood at Marin's fence line on a Tuesday morning and watched the piglets working the ground beneath the apple trees, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, which was its own kind of statement. Marin was on the other side of the orchard when she noticed them. She had been checking the soil at the base of the tree she privately called the grandfather tree, pressing her fingers into the ground, feeling for any change in the texture, any give that hadn't been there the week before. There wasn't much yet. 9 days was nothing. She knew that. But she checked anyway, every morning, because that was the only way she was going to catch it when it started. She walked over to the fence. "Morning," she said. Harlan nodded. Dale Pritchard looked at the pigs, then at Marin, then back at the pigs. "How many you got in there?" Dale asked. 42. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 42 pigs in a dead orchard. "Dying," Marin said. Dale looked at her. "What?" "Dying. Not dead. There's a difference." Dale glanced at Harlan the way people glance at each other when they're deciding whether to bother with a conversation. Harlan had his arms folded on the top rail of the fence and was watching the piglets with an expression that Marin couldn't fully read. Not quite contempt, not quite curiosity. Somewhere in between, like a man who has already made up his mind but wants to be sure. "Where'd you read about this?" Harlan asked. "Some book?" "Pamphlet." Pamphlet. He said it the way you'd say the word if someone had told you they were navigating by a hand-drawn map. "Marin, those trees haven't produced in 3 years. A pamphlet isn't going to fix that." "I'm not trying to fix it with a pamphlet," she said. "I'm trying to fix it with 42 pigs and about 8 months of consistent work." Dale Pritchard shook his head slowly. "That's your last money, isn't it? Those animals." She didn't answer that. He took her silence as confirmation, which it was. "You're going to lose them and the orchard both," he said. Not mean, just the specific tone of a man stating what he considers an obvious outcome. "Those runts aren't going to last a full season, and the trees are too far gone. You should have taken Harlan's offer." "I'll keep that in mind," Marin said. They left about 10 minutes later. She watched the truck pull out onto the county road, and she stood at the fence for a moment after it was gone, looking at the pigs moving through the pale soil under the gray trees, and she noticed that her jaw was tight. She made herself unclench it. Then she went back to checking the soil. The first month was the kind of hard that doesn't make for good stories because it's not dramatic. It's just relentless. Marin was up before 5 every morning, not because she had set an alarm, but because her body had recalibrated itself to farm time in the way bodies do when there is no alternative. She would dress in the dark, pull on boots that were still damp from the day before, and go out into whatever the morning was offering. Frost, mud, gray drizzle, the specific damp cold of an April that hadn't made up its mind yet, and begin. The pigs required more management than she had anticipated, which she accepted as information rather than failure. 3 of them had developed a habit of testing the fence at the northeast corner where the old post was soft, and she had to sink a new post in ground that was still half frozen, which took her 4 hours and left a blister on her right palm that split and bled, and she taped it up and kept going. The 2 with the eye issue had resolved with treatment, but a 4th had developed a mild respiratory problem that she caught early, dosed with what she had in the medical kit, and monitored twice a day until it cleared. She was not a vet. She had a battered copy of a livestock management guide she had found in town for $3 at a second-hand store, and she read it by lamplight most nights until she fell asleep over it. The feed was the constant arithmetic problem. She had bought what she could afford and calculated it against the number of animals and their expected growth rate, and the math was tight in the way that tight math always is. Workable in theory, unforgiving of any variable that didn't cooperate. One of the feed suppliers in town, a man named Roy Carver, who had done business with Thomas for years, told her when she came in for her second order that he had heard about the pigs. "Heard you bought a pen full of runts and put them in the dead orchard," he said. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something around his eyes. "That's about right," Marin said. "Thomas ever mentioned that idea to you?" "No, I found it on my own." Roy looked at her for a moment. He was a decent man. She had always thought so. And she could see him working something out behind his expression. "Feed's going to get expensive," he said. "Those animals grow. They eat more." "I know." "I can extend you 60 days on the account," he said, "given your situation." It was a real offer, and she knew it. It changed her numbers in a way that actually mattered. "Thank you, Roy," she said, and meant it. "Don't make me regret it," he said, but his voice was not unkind. She went home and revised her numbers for the 4th time that month. The changes in the soil started so small she almost missed them. It was a Wednesday in late April. She remembered it specifically because she had spent the morning arguing with the property tax office on the phone and had been too frustrated to eat lunch and had gone to the orchard just to get herself out of her own head. She pressed her fingers into the ground at the base of the third tree in the first row, a tree she'd been using as one of her monitoring points, and she felt something she hadn't felt before. Not softness exactly, a loosening. Like the top layer had begun to separate from the crust beneath it, the way soil does when something biological is starting to happen inside it. She dug down 2 inches with her fingers. The layer below was still hard and pale, but the surface had changed. She sat back on her heels and looked at the nearest piglet, who was rooting 6 feet away with its entire face committed to the project. "Okay," she said quietly. She didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell, for one thing. She didn't have the kind of relationship with her neighbors where she could announce a small change in soil texture and be taken seriously. And she wasn't ready to believe in it herself yet. She was careful about that. Hope is a resource, the same as feed or money, and she had learned in the past 2 months that spending it on something unproven was a fast way to run out of it. But she noted it in the small notebook she carried, and she pressed her fingers into that spot every morning after that. Harlan's second visit came in early May. He didn't bring Dale Pritchard this time. He came alone, in the evening, which was different enough from his usual manner that Marin was already paying careful attention before he said a word. She was mending fence on the south side when his truck came down the drive. She set down the pliers and waited. He got out of the truck and walked toward her and stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at the orchard for a moment. The pigs were visible between the trees, moving through the longer shadowed light of early evening. "I want to make you a formal offer," he said, "on the orchard parcel. 15 acres, the trees, water rights on the east side." He named a number. It was more than he'd implied in March. Not by a lot, but more. Marin wiped her hands on the back of her jeans. "What would you do with it?" Harlan seemed slightly surprised by the question. "Clear it. Put it in hay. You'd cut the trees." "Trees are done, Marin." "You keep saying that." He tilted his head, patient in that particular way of his. "What is it you think is going to happen out here? Those animals are going to restore 40-year-old trees that haven't set fruit in 3 years?" "I think it's possible, yes." "On the basis of a pamphlet." "On the basis of soil science that's older than both of us," she said. "The pamphlet just described it." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not respect exactly, but a kind of recalibration, like a man adjusting his estimate of a situation he thought he'd already fully assessed. "The offer's good through June," he said. "After that, I'm putting my money elsewhere." "I appreciate you telling me," Marin said. She picked up the pliers and went back to the fence. She heard his truck start. She kept working. What she didn't let herself think about, not in that moment, was the number he had offered. It was enough to clear the debt, all of it. The deferred tax, the creditor payment, the equipment balance, Roy Carver's 60-day extension, all of it, cleared with a small amount left. She would still have the farm, just without the orchard, just without the thing that had been the farm's center for 3 generations, just without the trees that Thomas's grandfather had planted and that Thomas had stood in front of with that particular farmer's grief that Marin had understood the moment she saw it. She drove a staple into a fence post harder than necessary. The May rains came and were both a blessing and a problem. The moisture was what the orchard soil needed, and Marin watched the ground under the trees absorb it differently than it had in March. The water was taking longer to run off, which meant the root zone was holding more than it had. She measured this by the old method she'd read in the pamphlet. A tin can pushed 2 inches into the ground, checked after rain, the depth of retained moisture noted. In March, the cans had been empty within hours. By mid-May, they were holding water for a full day. The problem with the rain was the mud, which the pigs enthusiastically made worse. 3 of them discovered they could create a wallow along the low drainage line on the west side of the orchard, and they committed to this project with such enthusiasm that Marin had to spend 3 mornings redirecting them, which meant being in the orchard at first light in rain gear, which meant arriving at her other chores damp and frustrated. She slipped once in the mud and went down hard on her knee, and she sat on the ground in the rain for about 45 seconds, taking inventory of herself. Nothing broken, dignity mildly bruised, and then got up and kept moving. She did not allow herself to feel sorry about that moment, but she noted it the way she noted everything now as information. The drainage line needed attention. She fixed it on the first dry day. The change in the community happened gradually, the way those changes usually do. Not as a single event, but as a slow shift in the texture of her daily interactions, a recalibration so incremental that she almost missed when it started. It began with a woman named Petra Sol, who lived on a small property about a mile east and who had always been friendly to Marin in the vague way of a neighbor who means well but has no particular reason to engage. Petra stopped her truck on the county road one morning in late May when Marin was walking back from the mailbox. "Can I ask you something?" Petra said through the open window. "Sure." "Those pigs of yours," she hesitated. "Is it true what Dale Pritchard's been saying, that you put them in the orchard to fix the trees?" "That's the plan," Marin said. Petra looked at her with an expression that Marin recognized. It was the expression of someone who wants to ask another question but isn't sure if it's rude. "And you think it'll work?" "I think the soil is changing," Marin said. "Whether that's enough for the trees, I don't know yet." Petra nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to keep pigs near her garden," she said. "She always said they improved the ground." She paused. "I thought it was just an old woman's idea." "Maybe old women knew more than we gave them credit for," Marin said. Petra looked at her for another moment, then smiled. A real one, not the kind people had been giving her since Thomas died, which were all sympathy layered over concern, layered over the quiet assumption that she was not going to make it. This was just a smile, the kind between two people who have just agreed on something that matters. "Well," Petra said. "Good luck." She drove on. Marin stood at the mailbox for a moment. The encounter shouldn't have meant much. It was a short conversation, but something in it had felt different from everything else she'd experienced in Bracken Hollow since March, and she turned it over in her mind on the walk back to the house. It was the first time anyone had asked her about the plan and genuinely wanted to understand it, not to challenge it, not to point out its flaws, not to reassess her body or her capacity or the likelihood of her failure, just to understand what she was doing and why. She found she had more to say about it than she'd realized. June brought heat that arrived early and stayed. The pigs thrived in it in the uncomplicated way that animals do when their conditions suit them. They ate, they rooted, they walled in the shaded spots. They grew. And they were growing. That was the thing that was now visible to anyone who drove past on the county road. Those undersized, rough-coated animals that no experienced farmer had wanted in April were not runts anymore. They were not impressive. Not yet, not by any standard she would have used at the Deller auction. But they had filled out in the shoulders and flanks, and their coats had improved with better feed and consistent condition. And when you watched them move through the orchard, there was a purpose to it that was hard to deny. The soil change was now something she could see as well as feel. She had started scraping back a 2-inch square patch of surface soil near each of her monitoring points every week, and photographing it with the small camera she'd found in Thomas's desk drawer. The photos from April were pale and close-grained, the dirt almost gray in the afternoon light, with that dusty surface characteristic of severely compacted ground. The photos from June showed something noticeably different, darker, with a grain that was starting to open, and in 2 of the spots she could see what she was almost certain was the beginning of earthworm activity. The small, irregular channels in the subsoil that meant something biological had come back to ground that had been essentially inert. She didn't show anyone the photos yet. She put them in the envelope with the weekly notes and the tin can moisture readings and kept them in the kitchen drawer. But she pressed her palm flat to the ground under the grandfather tree and felt the difference and allowed herself, alone in the evening with no one watching, to feel something close to relief. The conversation she'd been dreading happened on a Saturday in mid-June when her sister-in-law, Donna, Thomas's younger sister, drove up from Calhoun for a visit that Marin had suspected for 2 weeks was not entirely social in nature. Donna was a practical woman who managed accounts receivable for a medical group and applied the same methodical skepticism to personal situations that she applied to disputed invoices. She had liked Marin when Thomas was alive. Since his death, she had been concerned in the specific, precise way that practical people are concerned when they see a situation developing toward an outcome they consider foreseeable and preventable. She sat at Marin's kitchen table with coffee and looked at the notebooks and the envelope of photos and the yellow legal pads covered in numbers, and Marin walked her through it. The full plan, the pamphlet's methodology, the timeline, the soil readings, the moisture retention data, the photos, April versus June. Donna looked at everything carefully. She was quiet for a long time. "What happens if the trees don't blossom?" she said finally. "Then I've spent 8 months improving the soil for whoever buys the orchard parcel, and I've grown 42 pigs from runts to market weight for significantly less than market price," Marin said. "Which isn't nothing. It's not enough either." "No," Marin said, "it's not." Donna looked at the June photographs again. The dark soil, the earthworm channels. "You really think they're coming back?" "I think 3 of the trees have begun showing something in the cambium layer under the bark. Not much, but something." "What's the cambium layer?" "The living part under the bark. You can nick it with a knife and check the color. Green means it's alive. Brown means it's dead." She paused. "In March, the outer trees I checked were mostly brown. 2 of them last week were green." Donna put the photograph down and looked at her sister-in-law. "Thomas would have done this," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I know," Marin said, "but I'm the one doing it." Something shifted in Donna's expression at that. Not quite the recalibration that Harlan had shown, something more private, more personal. Like a woman revising a conclusion she had drawn too quickly and wasn't entirely comfortable about having drawn. She left after lunch with less of the concern visible in her face than she'd arrived with. She didn't say she thought it was going to work. She was too careful for that. But she also didn't repeat the suggestion she'd made twice on the phone in May, that Marin should accept Harlan's offer and simplify her situation before the situation simplified itself at her expense. The hardest week of June came near the end of it, when the combination of heat and reduced feed inventory put Marin in a position she had been managing toward for 2 months, and had finally arrived at anyway. She was going to run short by approximately 10 days before the next payment cycle would let her restock. Not dangerously short, the animals wouldn't be at risk, but short enough that she would need to supplement with something, and the options for that in Bracken Hollow were limited. She drove to Roy Carver's on a Thursday afternoon. "I need to extend the account another 30 days, she said, "and I need to know if you have any mixed grain seconds I can use as a supplement for 2 weeks." Roy looked at her from behind the counter. He had a way of thinking that was visible in his face. You could watch him work through it. "Seconds are 15% less protein," he said. "Those animals are in a growth phase." "I know. It's temporary." "How temporary?" 2 weeks, 3 at the outside." He thought about it. "I've got a partial pallet of mixed grain that got wet in the corner of the warehouse. It's not bad, just not premium. I was going to move it at a discount anyway." "What discount?" He named a price that was lower than she'd expected. She looked at him. "Roy, I'm not doing you any favors," he said, in the tone of a man absolutely doing someone a favor. "I need to move it, and you're here." She paid for the first portion out of the farm account and loaded it herself. On the drive home, with the truck pulling right as always and the heat shimmering off the county road, she thought about the phone call she had not made to Donna. She thought about the offer Harlan had said was good through June. She thought about this green tissue she had seen inside the bark of those 2 trees, how thin and tentative it had been, how easily it could amount to nothing at all. She was halfway home before she realized she was not actually considering calling Harlan. She was thinking about it the way you think about a door that is already closed, not as a real option, but as a thing that exists in the world and that you are aware of, and that you have already, at some level below conscious decision, decided against. That realization settled something in her. The last week of June, Marin began something she had not done since the week after Thomas died. She began talking to people. Not about her grief, she had never been that kind of person, and she wasn't starting now. But about the orchard, about what she was seeing in the soil. She mentioned the earthworm activity to Petra Sol when they ran into each other at the feed store. She showed Roy Carver the June photographs when she came in for the supplement grain. She described the cambium readings to a quiet, methodical man named Ed Forsyth, who she'd been introduced to at the county extension office when she went looking for soil testing materials, and who listened to her explain the whole methodology with his hands folded on the desk and his head slightly tilted, and then said, "That's a variation on a practice that was fairly common in this region before the 1960s. You'd be surprised how effective it was." "I wouldn't be, actually," Marin said. Ed Forsyth smiled at that. He was in his early 60s, with the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors and looked like it. He had been the county extension agent for almost 20 years. "You have any soil tests from before you started the pigs?" No, I didn't know to take them. Take them now, he said. Take them again in October. The comparison will tell you something. She bought the test kits and took the samples the next morning. The results, when they came back 2 weeks later, showed what she had begun to suspect, but had been careful not to assume. The nitrogen level in the orchard soil had increased by a measurable percentage since April, based on the comparison Ed had helped her construct from the county's historical soil data for that parcel. The pH, which had been shifted slightly acidic in a way that inhibited uptake, was moving toward neutral. The compaction measure, estimated through the penetrometer reading she'd taken, had improved by an amount that was, in the technical language of the test summary, significant relative to reported baseline. She read the results twice at the kitchen table. Then she folded them and put them in the envelope with everything else. And she made dinner, and she ate it standing at the counter because she was too tired to sit down. And outside through the window, she could see the last light on the orchard slope, the trees still gray and bare and holding nothing yet. But the ground beneath them was waking up. And Maren Whitlock, who was tired and underfunded and working alone in a county that had already written her ending, had the data to prove it. What she did not have yet, what everything still depended on, were the blossoms. And blossoms, she knew, could not be forced. They could not be argued into existence or purchased or willed. They would either come or they wouldn't, and nothing she had done would be worth anything until they did. She washed her plate. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. And the orchard held its silence in the dark outside. 41 trees that had not decided anything yet, guarding whatever was still alive in them with the complete indifference of old growth that has been through worse seasons than this and remembers nothing that didn't matter. The soil test results stayed in the envelope in the kitchen drawer through July, and Maren did not take them out again because she did not need to. She had the numbers in her head the way she kept all the numbers that mattered, not memorized exactly, but absorbed. The way you absorb a route you've driven enough times that your hands know the turns before your eyes see them. What she did instead was work. July in Bracken Hollow is not a gentle month. The heat comes down off the ridge in the afternoon and sits on the low ground like something with weight, and the work that needs doing doesn't adjust its schedule for it. Maren was up at 4:30 most mornings now, getting the heaviest outdoor tasks done before the temperature peaked, and by 2 in the afternoon she was doing the indoor work. The accounts, the feed calculations, the slow correspondence with the county tax office about the deferred payment arrangement she was trying to extend by another 60 days. They had said maybe. Maybe was not yes, but it was not no, and she had learned to operate in the space between those two things with more comfort than she would have thought possible 6 months ago. The pigs were unrecognizable. That was the only word for it. The 42 undersized animals she had loaded into a borrowed trailer in April and driven 40 miles home through an alignment-challenged truck were now, by any reasonable measure, not runts anymore. They had the kind of growth that happens when young animals get adequate nutrition and space and something to do with their bodies. Not spectacular growth, not the kind you'd write home about, but solid, consistent, the daily increment that adds up to something undeniable when you're not looking. Their shoulders had filled, their coats had evened out. They moved through the orchard with a confidence that was almost proprietary, like animals that understood this particular ground was theirs to manage. And the ground showed it. The orchard soil in July was something Maren had stopped taking for granted. She walked it every morning with the same attention she gave to the animals, pressing her fingers in at the monitoring points, checking the moisture retention, noting the color. The gray, powdery surface from March was gone. In its place was something darker and more complex in texture, with the kind of surface variation that tells you biological processes are happening underneath at multiple depths. She had found earthworm populations in 5 of her 8 monitoring points now. Earthworms do not live in dead soil. This was a thing she had not needed a pamphlet to tell her. What she still did not have, halfway through the 2nd month of summer, was any visible sign of life in the trees themselves. The cambium checks she'd been doing, the careful nick in the bark, the color reading, had shown green in 7 trees by late July, up from 2 in June. 7 out of 41 was not a majority. It was not even a confident plurality, but it was movement in a direction, and direction was what she was tracking, not speed. Speed was a luxury. Direction was survival. Harlan Vickery's June deadline came and went without a call from Maren, and she knew by the first week of July that he knew she wasn't going to call. She saw his truck on the county road once, slowing as it passed her drive, and she was at the fence line at the time and they made eye contact through his windshield. He didn't stop. She didn't raise her hand. The truck moved on, and that was the end of the offer that had been good through June. She was not sure how she felt about that, so she stopped thinking about it and went back to work. The first real crisis of summer arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late July, announced by nothing more dramatic than a pig that was standing apart from the others near the northwest corner of the orchard, not moving in the purposeful way the animals normally moved, and holding its head slightly low. Maren noticed it at 3 in the afternoon when she was doing her rounds. She went into the orchard and crouched down beside the animal and looked at it carefully. Its eyes were dull. Its respiration was slightly elevated. When she pressed along its flank, it didn't react the way a healthy animal should. She went inside and got the livestock guide and her medical kit and came back. She spent the next 4 hours with that pig. It was not an animal she had named. She had made a deliberate decision in April not to name any of them, because naming makes decisions harder, and she knew there might be decisions ahead of her that needed to be made without sentiment complicating them. But she knew this particular animal by sight, the way you know individuals in a group you've managed closely for months. The slightly asymmetrical patch behind its left ear, the way it always worked the fence perimeter first before moving toward the center of the orchard. By 7 o'clock, she had identified what she was fairly sure was a digestive impaction, treated it with what she had in the kit, and moved the animal to a separate pen where she could monitor it overnight without the rest of the group disturbing it. She set an alarm for 2 in the morning to check on it. When she got up at 2, the pig was standing and had eaten a small amount. She stood in the dark pen with a flashlight and watched it for a few minutes and felt the particular kind of relief that is mostly exhaustion and very little triumph. She reset the alarm and went back to bed. The pig was fine by morning. She returned it to the orchard that afternoon, and it went directly to the southeast corner and began rooting with a dedication that suggested it had opinions about the time it had lost. Maren watched it go and said nothing to nobody about the previous 24 hours, because there was nobody to say it to, and also because she had begun to notice something about the kind of person she was becoming in this situation. She was not a person who needed the difficulty acknowledged. She needed it handled. There was a difference, and she had not always known what that difference felt like from the inside. August arrived with a thunderstorm that flooded the drainage line she'd repaired in May and required her to spend a full day and a half regrading it by hand with tools she was not entirely confident in using. She did it anyway, incorrectly the first time, correctly the second time, and the drainage held after that. Ed Forsyth drove out one afternoon in the second week of August. He called ahead, which she appreciated. He walked the orchard with her for about an hour, asking questions and listening to her answers with the attentiveness of someone who is genuinely learning rather than confirming what he already thinks. "You've got good movement in the soil biology," he said, crouching at the third monitoring point and pressing his own fingers into the dark earth. "Better than I would have predicted at this stage." "Is it enough for the trees?" she asked. He stood and looked at the canopy above them, the bare gray branches that still showed nothing. "You've got 7 greens on the cambium check?" "As of last week, 3 more I'm not sure about." He was quiet for a moment. "The trees are making a decision," he said finally. "That's the most accurate thing I can tell you. The conditions are improving enough that the root systems are beginning to respond. Whether that response gets all the way to the point of blossom, that I can't tell you. But it's possible." "It's more possible now than it was in April," he said. "That's what I can honestly say." She nodded. She had learned to take honest assessments over optimistic ones, because honest ones could be planned around. Ed started back toward his truck and then stopped. "Harlan Vickery told Dale Pritchard you turned down his offer," he said without turning around. "That's right." He turned then and looked at her with something in his face that wasn't quite an expression she could name. "Why?" he said. Not skeptically, genuinely. "Because the land isn't finished," she said, "and neither am I." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once, the way men of his generation nod when they've decided to take something seriously, and walked to his truck and drove back down the county road. September was when things began to break. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the cumulative weight of the summer, the feed costs, the unexpected medical supply expense for the pig in July, the drain regrade, the ongoing tax correspondence, the 1,000 small material costs of maintaining 42 animals through a full growing season, had compressed the financial margin to a point where Marin was managing day to day in a way that required constant attention and left almost no room for error. The tractor's hydraulic line finally gave up completely in the first week of September, and she could not fix it. She did not have the funds, and she did not have the expertise, and she called 2 mechanics before accepting that neither the cost nor the timeline was workable, given what she had available. She left the tractor in the barn and did the work it would have done by hand or by alternative means, which added approximately 2 hours to each day's workload and meant that some things did not get done as thoroughly as they should have. She was tired in September in a way that was different from the tiredness of April or June. April's tiredness was grief layered over physical demand. June's was the constant arithmetic problem layered over heat. September's was deeper and quieter and harder to locate. The specific depletion that comes from sustaining a difficult thing for long enough that you can no longer remember what not difficult felt like. She did not talk about this. She continued the morning rounds, the soil checks, the cambium readings. She continued the accounts and the feed calculations and the tax correspondence. She ate poorly some weeks because she was too tired to cook properly, and ate well other weeks when she had the energy to make something real. She slept between 5 and 6 hours most nights, occasionally 7, once or twice less than 4, when the wind was wrong or her mind wouldn't stop. She was checking the cambium on the 8th tree in the 2nd row on a Tuesday morning in mid-September when her knife showed green and something else. A faint swelling at the bud site, barely perceptible, the kind of change you would absolutely miss if you were not looking for it specifically. She checked 2 more trees. Both of them showed it. She stood in the orchard with the knife in her hand and the September light coming flat and sideways through the bare branches, and she did not allow herself to name what she was seeing yet. Naming it too early was how you broke something fragile. She had learned that. She photographed both sites, labeled them in the notebook, and continued her rounds. But her hands were not entirely steady for the rest of the morning, and she knew why. The bud swelling was real. 3 days later, there were 6 trees showing it. A week after that, 9. She called Ed Forsyth on a Thursday afternoon from the kitchen phone, which still had a cord because Thomas had never seen the point of replacing it. 9 trees with bud development, she said. Confirmed visible swelling at the lateral bud sites. There was a pause. In September? Yes. Another pause, longer. That's not the typical window, he said. Bud development this late in the season is unusual. Is it bad unusual? No, he said, and she could hear him thinking. It could be the trees responding to improved root conditions by trying to set energy reserves before dormancy, which would actually indicate the root systems are more active than I thought at this point. So they might blossom in spring. I wouldn't say might, he said carefully. I'd say the probability just improved significantly. She thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, not doing anything in particular. Then she got up and went outside, because sitting still had never been something she was very good at. Harlan appeared at her fence line again in late September. She had not seen him in over 2 months, and the fact of his presence now, unannounced, on an overcast Thursday morning when she was moving the pigs to the northern section of the orchard to begin working that soil, made her stomach tighten slightly before she controlled it. He did not come to the gate. He stood at the fence and watched her work. She finished directing the animals before she walked over. I heard you've got bud development, he said. News traveled in Bracken Hollow, always had. She did not ask who had told him. On 9 trees, she said, as of last week. He looked at the orchard. The pigs were already engaged with the new section, their noses working the surface of ground that had not yet had the same treatment as the southern end. That's something, he said, and the 2 words were harder for him than he made them sound. She could tell by the way his jaw moved slightly after he said them. It is, she said. I owe you an apology, he said. She had not expected that. She waited. What I said in March, he said, about your size, about whether you could handle it. He looked at the fence post rather than at her. That was wrong of me to say. Marin considered him for a moment. Harlan Vickery was not a man who apologized easily or often, and she understood that this moment had cost him something, and she respected that without allowing it to change anything that had already been decided between them. I know you meant it practically, she said, not cruelly. That doesn't make it right. No, she agreed. It doesn't. He nodded. He looked at the orchard once more, at the animals moving purposefully through the gray trees, at the darker soil visible beneath the root zone, at the branches that were still bare but that held now, underneath their bark, 9 small promises of what might come. "If it blossoms," he said, "I'll be the first one down that drive to say I was wrong." "I'll hold you to that," Maren said. He left, and she watched him go. And she felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not satisfaction exactly, and not forgiveness exactly, though it was adjacent to both. More like the particular relief of a thing being said that needed to be said, after months of it going unsaid. She went back to the pigs. October came in cold, earlier than usual, with a hard frost in the 3rd week that caught Maren slightly underprepared. She had been watching the forecast and had the animals' shelter reinforced, but the temperature dropped lower than predicted on 2 consecutive nights, and she spent both of them in the barn, checking on the pigs every 2 hours with a lantern, her breath visible in the air. The animals pressed together in the way of creatures who understand collective warmth. The frost on the orchard was beautiful in the way of things that are threatening. The gray branches glazed white in the pre-dawn light, the soil stiff and crystallized at the surface. She walked the rows both mornings, checking the trees, pressing her fingers to the bark near the bud sites, telling herself she was checking for damage, and not, beneath that, checking for something she was afraid of losing. The bud sites held. The cold had not reached them, or the trees had protected them. She wasn't sure which, and it didn't matter. They were intact, and the 15 trees she now had showing swelling remained showing it, and she went inside and made coffee and drank all of it standing at the window, looking at the frost-covered slope. 15 trees. In March, she had been told that all 41 were dead. By the 3rd week of October, the county had begun, in its indirect way, to pay attention. It started with the soil tests. Ed Forsyth had submitted her results. The April baseline constructed from historical data and the October actuals from the tests she'd taken that month, to a small agricultural newsletter that went to county extension offices and a loose network of working farmers in 4 counties. He had asked her permission first, and she had said yes, because she had no reason to say no, and because the data was real, and real data should be available to the people who could use it. The newsletter was not widely read. But in small agricultural communities, widely read is not the threshold that matters. The threshold is whether the right people read it, and in this case, one of them was a woman named Carol Beaumont, who managed a small orchard operation 40 miles south, and who had been struggling with similar soil depletion issues for 6 years. Carol called Maren on a Wednesday evening in late October, having gotten her number from Ed. "I read about what you're doing," Carol said. "The pig rotation. Are you willing to talk about it?" Maren was sitting at the kitchen table with the feed calculations for November. She put down the pencil. "Sure," she said. They talked for over an hour. Maren walked Carol through the methodology, the stocking density, the rotation schedule, the soil monitoring, the cambium checks. She described the problems she'd encountered and how she'd worked around them. She did not overstate the results. She was careful to say, more than once, that the trees had not blossomed yet and that the question was still open. "But you think they will," Carol said. "I think the conditions are right," Maren said. "That's all I can tell you." Carol was quiet for a moment. "You're a brave woman," she said. "I'm a practical one," Maren said. "There's a difference." Carol laughed at that. A real laugh, not the polite kind. "Can I come see it? In the spring, if things go the way you're hoping?" "If things go the way I'm hoping," Maren said, "you are absolutely welcome." She hung up the phone and sat for a moment and thought about that. Someone wanting to come see what she had done, not to evaluate whether she had failed, but because they wanted to learn from it. The thought had a texture to it that she wasn't used to. She picked up the pencil and went back to the feed calculations. November arrived, and the pigs went into the barn for their winter quarters. This had always been the plan. The orchard work for the season was largely done, the ground needed to rest and process through winter, and the animals needed protection from the temperatures that were coming. She had built the winter pen in August from materials she'd sourced over the summer, piece by piece, when she had small amounts of money to spend and specific needs to meet. Moving 42 pigs is not a graceful undertaking under any circumstances, and these 42 were no longer the small, manageable animals she'd purchased in April. They were healthy, full-bodied, strong-shouldered animals with opinions about where they wanted to go, and the process of relocating them from the orchard to the barn required most of a morning, the assistance of 2 panels of fencing she used to create a temporary corridor, and a great deal of patience that she had to actively cultivate in real time. She got the last of them in by noon. She stood at the barn door and looked back at the empty orchard. It was the first time since April that she had seen it without the pigs in it, and it looked different, larger somehow, and quieter, but not in the abandoned way it had looked when Thomas was alive, and they both knew it was failing. The ground between the trees was visibly darker, visibly textured in the way of soil that has things living inside it. The trees stood in the gray November light with their bare branches and their swollen bud sights, and the difference between now and 8 months ago was not a thing she could have articulated to someone who hadn't walked the rows with her in both seasons. But she could see it. She knew every tree on that slope, and she could see it. She closed the barn door and went to make lunch. The second crisis of the season arrived in the second week of November in the form of a letter from the county tax office that was not the extension she had been expecting. They had reviewed her application for an extended payment deferral and had determined, in the measured language of county government communications, that her account did not qualify for a further extension given the existing balance and the duration of the existing deferral. Payment in full was required by the 15th of December. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table. The number they were asking for was real. It was not a number she had. She had known for weeks that this was a possible outcome. She had not been counting on the extension exactly, but she had been planning in a way that assumed it as one of the more likely scenarios. And now that it was off the table, she needed to revise the plan in a meaningful way within a short time. She called Donna that evening. "I need to think out loud," she said when Donna picked up. "Go ahead," Donna said, without preliminary. This was one of the things Maren had always respected about Thomas's sister. She didn't require a preamble. Maren walked her through the numbers, the tax bill, the current account balance, the feed commitments for winter, the remaining creditor payment due in February. The gap between what she had and what she owed was not catastrophic, but it was not bridgeable from her current position without doing something she hadn't yet done. "What are your options?" Donna asked. "I can sell 4 of the pigs for immediate income," Maren said. "I've been holding them for spring market, but the December price will be lower." "How much lower?" "Enough that I'd need to sell 6 instead of 4. "And that covers the tax bill?" "It covers most of it. I'd still be short about 400. Donna was quiet. "I can loan you the 400, she said. Maren had known this might be offered and had been deciding how she felt about it for the past 2 hours. "I want to call it a loan with a written agreement," she said. "Terms and repayment schedule." "Fine," Donna said. "I'll write it up." "And Donna," she paused, "I'm going to pay it back." "I know you are," Donna said, in the tone of someone who has genuinely revised their estimation of a situation and wants that to be clear. "That's not why I offered." Maren sold 6 pigs to a buyer in Delaware the following week. She drove them down in the borrowed trailer on a cold Tuesday morning and drove back with a check that was less than she'd hoped and enough for what she needed. She deposited it, paid the tax bill by certified mail before the end of the week, received Donna's $400 by mail with a typed loan agreement enclosed, and filed the agreement in the kitchen drawer next to the soil test results. The account was no longer overdrawn. She allowed herself one evening where she did not work after dinner. She sat in the living room, something she almost never did, because the living room still had Thomas's books arranged the way he'd arranged them, and his reading chair in the corner, and she had been avoiding it without quite acknowledging that she was doing so. And she sat there in the quiet and let herself be still for about an hour. It was not comfortable, but it was real. And she was learning to value those two things the same. December moved toward her steadily, the way hard winters do in Bracken Hollow, not arriving all at once but building, each day a degree colder than the last, the frost line deepening, the sky going the particular flat white that means serious weather is somewhere to the northwest and coming. The pigs settled into their winter routine with the adaptability of animals that have had a good season and have reserves in their bodies. She checked them 3 times a day, morning and midday and before dark, and adjusted their feed and bedding as the temperatures required. She also walked the orchard every morning. There was nothing to look for now. The trees were fully dormant, the bud sights locked under bark that gave nothing away, but she walked it anyway, not checking, just walking, putting her feet on the darker ground, looking at the trees in the winter light, maintaining the relationship that had begun in March, in the dark with a flashlight and a pamphlet that had changed everything. She was walking the third row on a morning in mid-December when she stopped. She wasn't sure at first what had made her stop. Her eyes were moving across the branches the way they always did, habitual now, reading the trees the way you read faces you know well. And then she saw it. On the grandfather tree, the one at the end of the second row that Thomas had named, that Maren had checked first every single morning since April, that had been the last tree to show green on the cambium test and the first one she had hoped for. There was something at the primary bud site. Not swelling. Swelling she'd been seeing for weeks. This was different. This was a faint, papery edge at the very tip of the bud, a color that was not quite gray and not quite the brown of dormant bark. Something between. She leaned in close. She had read enough by now to know what she was looking at, and to know that knowing what you're looking at and believing it are not always the same thing. The bud was beginning to open. It was not a blossom. It was not even close to a blossom. It was the earliest, most tentative precursor of a blossom, a cracking at the very tip of the bud casing, in the way of something that has been sealed for a long time and is beginning to remember that it was not always sealed. It was December. It was cold. The normal window for apple blossom development in this region was April and May, and what she was looking at was 3 to 4 months ahead of that, which was either a sign of severe stress in the tree or a sign of something she did not have a word for yet. She did not take a photograph. Her hands were not steady enough. She stood at the grandfather tree for a long time, long enough that the cold came through her coat in the way it does when you stop moving, and she did not move. Then, slowly, she reached out and put one hand flat on the bark of the trunk, the way she had done in March when she was deciding whether to believe this was possible. The bark was rough and gray and cold. And somewhere underneath it, in the cambium, in the roots that were now alive in ground that had been dead, in the 41 trees that Bracken Hollow had declared finished, something was awake. Maren Whitlock stood in her orchard in December with her hand on the grandfather tree, and she did not cry, because she was not that kind of person, and she did not say anything, because there was no one to say anything to. But something in her chest, some specific held tension that had been there since the morning she found Thomas on the kitchen floor 9 months ago, released a fraction of itself into the cold air and was gone. She put both hands in her pockets. She walked back to the barn to check on the pigs. The bud on the grandfather tree did not open further that week. Maren checked it every morning, and it held exactly where it was, that faint papery crack at the tip, no more and no less, as if the tree had made one small declaration and was now waiting to see how the world responded before committing to anything further. She understood that. She had been doing something similar herself for 9 months. The cold deepened through the second half of December in the way of cold that means business. The temperature dropped into the single digits on 4 consecutive nights before Christmas, and she spent those nights running on the same schedule she'd kept during the October frost, up every 2 hours, lantern in hand, moving through the barn, checking on 42 animals whose winter coats had come in thick and whose body condition, after a full season of good feed and active work, was better than anything she could have hoped for in April. They were not the same animals she'd brought home from Deller. Not in any way that mattered. She did not go to the orchard during those bitter nights. There was nothing she could do for the trees in that temperature, and she had learned by now the discipline of not checking on things she couldn't affect. The bud either survived the cold or it didn't. The roots either held the warmth of the changed soil or they didn't. These were not decisions she was part of. Christmas came and went quietly. Donna drove up from Calhoun on the 23rd and stayed 2 nights, and they ate dinner together both evenings at the kitchen table where Maren had spread the accounts to one side to make room for actual plates. It was not a sad Christmas, exactly, but it was a careful one, the first without Thomas, which meant every small tradition had to be either kept or quietly set aside, and there was no obvious right answer for most of them. They kept the ones that felt like themselves and let the others go without ceremony. On the second evening, Donna asked about the bud on the grandfather tree. Maren had told her about it on the phone the week it appeared, in the specific, factual way she told Donna things. The observation, the possible interpretation, the uncertainty. Donna had listened and said very little, which was the appropriate response to information that was real but not yet conclusive. "Still there," Maren said. "Hasn't changed in 2 weeks. Is that normal for December?" Nothing about this is what I'd call normal, Maren said. But Ed says winter bud activity isn't unheard of in trees that are recovering root function after a long dormancy. The root system becomes active, starts pushing energy up, and the bud sites respond. So it's a good sign. It's a sign, Maren said carefully. Whether it's good depends on what happens in March. Donna looked at her across the table. There was something in her expression that had been there since September, since the soil test results maybe, or since the conversation where Maren had said, "I'm the one doing it," a specific kind of regard that was different from the concerned worry of the spring. It looked more like what you give someone when you've been proven wrong about them in a way you are genuinely glad about. "You're going to make it," Donna said. Not a question. Maren picked up her fork. "Ask me in April." Donna almost smiled. "I'm asking you now." Maren thought about it, really thought about it, the way she thought about soil conditions and feed ratios and tax deadlines, practically and without sentimentality. The farm was still in debt, the tractor was still broken, the orchard had not blossomed and might not. She had 6 fewer pigs than she'd started the winter with and was running on a loan from her sister-in-law and a 60-day feed account extension from Roy Carver. "I think I'm going to make it," she said. The difference between that sentence in December and the same sentence in March was the difference between a guess and a position. January arrived and the county settled into the particular silence of a Bracken Hollow winter, which is not peaceful silence, but rather the silence of everything being suppressed, sound and color and movement, all reduced to their minimum, waiting. Maren had always found January difficult, even before Thomas, even in years when the farm was in reasonable shape, and she had no particular reason for dread. There was something about the month that sat on her, some quality of the light and the cold, and the specific way time moved when there was less work to do that made the interior of her own head louder than she preferred. She managed it the way she managed everything now, with routine. Morning checks, midday checks, evening checks. The accounts, which she reviewed every few days, even when there was nothing new in them, because the habit of knowing exactly where she stood financially had become as essential as any other daily practice. She read in the evenings, not the livestock guides or the soil science pamphlets that had been her reading material for most of the year, but actual books, fiction mostly. Things she'd been meaning to read for years that Thomas had kept on the shelves in the living room she'd been avoiding. She had started going into the living room. It had happened gradually, the way most of her adjustments had. Not a decision exactly, more like an accumulation of small moments that added up to a changed pattern. She had gone in one night in November to look for a specific reference in one of Thomas's farming books, and had ended up standing in front of his shelves for 20 minutes, running her fingers along the spines. She had taken one book that night, and then another the following week. And now she was in the room most evenings, in the chair that was not Thomas's chair but was near it, reading until she fell asleep. She did not feel his absence less in that room, but she had stopped feeling it as something to protect herself from. The bud on the grandfather tree had not changed by January's end, and she had stopped checking it daily. Weekly was enough. The tree knew what it was doing and did not need her anxiety as a companion. What she did check daily was the barn floor drainage, because the January thaws were unreliable, and the warmth that came through the second week of January created exactly the kind of partial melt that could flood a poorly drained barn floor and compromise the winter bedding in ways that were expensive and miserable to deal with. She had reinforced the drainage in November, and it held mostly, though she spent 2 mornings in mid-January moving wet bedding and replacing it before the temperature dropped again and the floor refroze. On one of those mornings, her back gave out. Not dramatically, not an injury exactly, more the specific failure of a muscle group that had been overworked for 9 months and had reached its limit on a cold morning while she was lifting a wet bale of straw at an angle she should have thought more carefully about. She felt it go, a sharp pull along the left side of her lower back, and she put the bale down and stood up straight and held very still for a moment, taking inventory. She could move. That was the first thing. She tested each direction carefully and determined that she had strained something that was going to be extremely unpleasant for several days, but was not the kind of injury that required a hospital. She finished the barn work anyway, more slowly, differently angled, stopping 3 times to rest against the wall. It took twice as long as normal. She went inside and took what she had for pain and lay on the floor with her knees bent for 45 minutes, which was the position that helped the most, and looked at the kitchen ceiling and thought about nothing in particular because thinking required energy she did not currently have. The back took 11 days to return to something approaching functional. In those 11 days, she did not stop working. She modified. She asked Petra Sol, with some difficulty, if Petra's teenage son could help with the heavy lifting for a few mornings. Petra said yes immediately and sent the boy over. A quiet, large kid named Marcus, who worked without complaint and did not ask questions, which Marin valued more than she could have explained. She paid him what she could, which was not much, and Marcus seemed unbothered by that. She did not ask Harlan Vickery for help. She was aware that this was partly stubbornness and partly something more practical, accepting help from Harlan. While the question of the orchard was still open, would have complicated the dynamic between them in ways she did not want to manage. Harlan had apologized. She had received the apology. The relationship between them was in a better place than it had been in March. She wanted to keep it there, which meant keeping the boundaries clear. Her back healed. Marcus went back to his regular life. February arrived. February was the month the newsletter piece found a wider audience. Ed Forsyth had submitted the original article to a small regional publication in late fall, and it had been picked up and reprinted, with Marin's permission, which Ed had obtained in advance, in a slightly larger agricultural journal that circulated across 6 states. The piece was factual and careful, exactly the way Ed approached everything. It described the methodology, cited the soil test data, noted the cambium readings, and was appropriately measured about the outcome, which was still pending. It referred to Marin by name. She found out about the reprinting from Carol Beaumont, who called her on a Wednesday evening in the first week of February. "You're in the Midwest Agricultural Review," Carol said. Marin was quiet for a moment. "The big one?" "Page 12, Ed's piece, with your name and your county and your test data." Marin thought about what that meant. How many people read that? "In print, a few thousand. But it's also online." Carol paused. "Marin, I've already gotten 2 calls from people asking how to reach you." "What kind of people?" "Farmers with depleted orchards. One of them is in Wisconsin. The other one is in Pennsylvania." A pause. "They want to know what you did." Marin sat with that for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the February dark was complete. The kind of dark that has no gradations, just a flat black pressing against the glass. Inside the barn, the pigs were settled for the night. The account books were in the kitchen drawer with Donna's loan agreement, and in the orchard, the grandfather tree was holding its single cracked bud against a winter that had been trying its patience for 2 months. "I haven't proven it works yet," Marin said. "You've proven the soil science works," Carol said. "That's already more than most people have managed." "Tell them to wait until April," Marin said. "If I've got blossoms in April, I'll talk to anyone who wants to listen." Carol said she would. She also said she was still planning to come in the spring if the invitation stood. Marin told her it stood. She hung up the phone and looked at the kitchen drawer where the accounts were. She thought about 2 farmers in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania with dying orchards who had read her name in a journal and wanted to know what she'd done. She thought about Ed Forsyth submitting that piece with the kind of methodical confidence of someone who had looked at the data and decided it deserved attention. She thought about Roy Carver extending her account, and Petra Sol sending her son over without being asked twice, and Donna's typed loan agreement in the drawer. She thought about March of the previous year, standing on the porch with untouched coffee and a man telling her she wouldn't make it. The distance between that morning and this one was not what she had imagined when she was living in it. It was not a clean arc. It was not a transformation. It was 11 months of specific daily decisions made under conditions of genuine uncertainty, and most of the decisions had been correct, and some of them had been wrong, and she had adjusted for the wrong ones and kept moving. That was what it actually looked like from the inside. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. March came in with the first tentative change in the light that means winter is considering its exit. Not warm yet, not even close, but the quality of the afternoon sun shifting just enough that you notice it if you've been waiting for it. Marin had been waiting for it. She was in the orchard every morning now, without exception. The pigs were still in the barn. She would not move them back to the orchard until she was certain the ground temperature was stable and the frost line had retreated. But she walked the rows alone each day in the early light, checking every tree in a sequence she had memorized so thoroughly that she could have done it in the dark. The grandfather tree showed her something new on a Tuesday morning in the second week of March. The cracked bud she'd been watching since December had opened slightly further overnight, and what was visible now at the tip was not bark and not dry matter, but something greenish and closed, the earliest possible stage of a bud preparing to extend. She stood in front of that tree for 5 minutes without moving, looking at it from different angles in the morning light, making absolutely certain she was seeing what she thought she was seeing. She was. She went inside and called Ed. "The grandfather tree is breaking dormancy," she said. "I can see the first leaf tissue." "What's your overnight low been?" he asked immediately. 28, 26 one night last week. "And the bud tissue looks healthy? Not damaged?" "Healthy. Green. Clean edges." A pause. She could hear him breathing, which meant he was thinking seriously. "The root system is warmer than the air temperature," he said. "The soil changes you made. The biology is generating heat down there. The tree is responding to the root signal, not the air temperature." "Is that a problem?" "It could be if we get a late hard freeze. The tissue is tender at this stage." Another pause. "But Marin, this is the tree responding to restored root function. This is exactly what the methodology was supposed to produce." She sat down on the porch step. She had not planned to sit down. "I need to check the other trees," she said. "Yes," he said. "Call me when you have a full count." She spent the rest of that morning in the orchard. By noon, she had checked all 41 trees and had found early bud break, the first visible signs of green tissue at the bud sites, on 17 of them, 17 out of 41, including 3 trees she had not seen any cambium activity in since she'd started checking in March of the previous year. She called Ed back. 17, she said. The silence on his end was brief and expressive. Yes, that's a meaningful number. Is it enough to consider the methodology successful?" "Marin." His voice had something in it she had not heard from him before, some quality of genuine feeling pressing through the measured professional tone. 17 trees in an orchard that was written off completely a year ago is not a question of enough. That is a significant result. She thanked him and hung up. She sat on the porch step in the March cold for a while, not checking anything, not planning anything, just sitting. The news moved through Bracken Hollow. The way news moves in a small county, not through any single announcement, but through the accumulation of individual conversations, each one passing the information along to the next person who didn't yet have it. By the end of the week, she was getting visitors at the fence line. Not many. 3 or 4 over the first weekend. People who drove slowly down the county road and stopped their vehicles and looked toward the orchard, where nothing visible had changed. The trees were still bare from the road, the bud break too small to see at that distance. But they stopped anyway, and some of them raised a hand when they saw Marin in the yard, and she raised one back. Petrosol came to the gate on a Saturday morning with a covered dish, a casserole of some kind, warm, wrapped in a towel. She handed it over the fence. "I heard about the trees," she said. 17 showing bud break, Marin said. "It's early. A lot can still go wrong." "I know," Petra said, "but 17. Marin took the casserole inside. She ate half of it standing at the counter and put the rest in the refrigerator and felt the particular warmth of being fed by someone who did it because they wanted to and not because they felt obligated. Harlan came on a Sunday. He came as he had promised, down the drive, not stopped at the fence line on the road. He knocked at the gate and Marin met him there and let him in and walked him into the orchard. He did not say much on the walk. He looked at the trees, at the ground beneath them, at the darker soil, at the places where the texture was visibly different from what you'd find in any unmanaged field in this county. She stopped at the grandfather tree and pointed to the bud site. He leaned in close, the way she had, and looked at the greenish tissue for a long moment. When he straightened up, his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "I was wrong," he said. "Yes," she said. Not unkindly, just accurately. He looked at the tree for another moment. All of it. About the pigs, about the orchard, about... He stopped. He looked at her. "About what I said in March. About your capacity." "You already apologized for that," she said. "I know. I wanted to say it here, in front of the evidence." She held his gaze for a moment. This man who had come to her gate the week after her husband's funeral, with his 2 men standing by the truck, and told her the land was going to eat her alive. She thought about the weight of a year. She thought about what it meant to stand in the middle of a thing you'd been told was impossible. "Come back in April," she said, "if the blossoms come." "I'll be here," he said. He meant it, she could tell. He walked back out to his truck, and she walked to the next tree in the row and put her fingers on the bark and checked. The third week of March brought the freeze she had been afraid of since December. It came in overnight on a Wednesday, dropping 20 degrees in 6 hours, the kind of rapid temperature decline that a weather system produces when it has momentum behind it. Maren had been watching the forecast for 4 days and had done what she could. She had moved additional insulating mulch to the base of each tree, concentrated around the root zone where the biological heat was now measurable with the soil thermometer she'd borrowed from Ed. She had covered the 6 most advanced trees, the ones where the bud break was furthest along and therefore most vulnerable, with the frost cloth she'd ordered in February precisely for this contingency. She was up at midnight. She was up at 2. She was up at 4. At 4 in the morning, the temperature outside was 19 degrees, and the wind had come up from the northwest and was moving through the orchard with a purpose that felt personal. She stood at the barn door with the lantern and looked out at the covered trees in the dark, and she made herself go back inside, because standing there changed nothing, and she had learned the discipline of that. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. She thought about what she could and could not control, which was a practice she had been refining for 12 months and had not yet perfected. She could not control the temperature or the wind or the biology of what was happening in those bud sites in the dark. She had done what she could do. The rest was not hers. At 6 in the morning, the temperature began to rise. Slowly, a degree at a time, the way recovery always happens, incrementally, without drama. By 8, she was in the orchard. She removed the frost cloth from the first covered tree and examined the bud sites. Intact. The second tree. Intact. 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. She went down the row checking each one with hands that were stiff from the cold and not entirely steady. Every bud site she had been most worried about was intact. The insulating mulch had held the root zone temperature. The frost cloth had protected the most advanced tissue. She had lost nothing. She stood in the middle of the orchard in the early morning cold, and the relief that went through her was so physical it almost buckled her knees. Not almost. It did slightly. She put one hand against the nearest trunk for a second and steadied herself. Then she straightened up, put the frost cloth under her arm, and went to check the remaining trees. April arrived the way April arrives in Bracken Hollow. Not gently, not all at once, but in the specific incremental way of a season that knows it's being waited for and is not particularly hurried. The light changed first, then the ground temperature climbed past the threshold where the frost line fully retreated from the surface. Then the pigs came back out. Moving them from the barn back into the orchard required less drama than the November relocation. They were not confused about where they were going. They had spent a winter in the barn, and they knew the orchard the way they knew their own instincts. And when Maren opened the gate on the first genuinely mild morning of April, they moved through it with a confidence that made her laugh out loud, alone in the field, which was the first time she had laughed like that in longer than she could accurately calculate. The laugh surprised her. She stood there after it had finished and felt slightly embarrassed and slightly lighter, and went on with her morning. Carol Beaumont came on a Saturday in the second week of April. She drove up from 40 miles south in a truck that was older than Maren's and pulled into the drive with the particular uncertainty of someone who has navigated by directions rather than familiarity. She was in her early 50s, with the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors without apology, and she stepped out of the truck and looked immediately at the orchard slope. "Is that them?" she said. Maren looked at what Carol was looking at. On the southern slope, on 23 trees, the count had grown from 17 through the end of March as more root activity translated upward. The bud break had progressed through the stages she had been watching for a month. The leaf tissue had extended. The bud sites had swelled further, and on 4 of the trees, including the grandfather tree, there was now visible at the tip of each swollen bud something that was unmistakably, undeniably a blossom beginning to form. Not open. Not yet. But present. "That's them," Maren said. Carol stood at the fence with both hands on the top rail and looked at the orchard for a long time without speaking. She had the expression of someone who had been believing in something for a long time and was now looking at proof. "Can we go in?" she said. They walked the rows together. Maren named each tree she had been monitoring, described the timeline of the cambium readings, pointed out the differences in the soil at various points in the orchard, the furthest treated areas versus the sections the pigs had reached last, where the improvement was measurable but less advanced. Carol asked precise, practical questions and listened to the answers with full attention, and at no point did she say anything that sounded like she was doubting what she was seeing. They stopped at the grandfather tree. The 4 blossom formations at the tip of the primary bud cluster were fully visible now, still closed but undeniably present, the papery outer casing beginning to thin and separate, the shape underneath unmistakably floral. Carol reached out and touched the bark of the trunk gently, not the blossom, just the bark. "How many days?" she said. "Until they open?" Marin looked at the bud formation. 3 days? Maybe 4. Carol lowered her hand. "I want to come back," she said. "When they open." "Come back," Marin said. They walked out of the orchard and stood at the fence and looked back at the slope. The pigs were visible between the trees, moving with their habitual purposefulness through the ground that was now, by every metric Marin had been tracking, alive in a way it had not been for years. "What are you going to do now?" Carol asked. "When this is proven, when people know?" Marin thought about the 2 farmers in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. She thought about Ed Forsyth's newsletter piece. She thought about the letter from the county tax office in November, and the 6 pigs she'd sold below market price, and Donna's typed loan agreement, and Roy Carver's 60-day extension, and 11 months of before 5 mornings in boots that were always slightly damp. "I'm going to get through harvest," she said, "and then I'm going to think about the following year." Carol nodded. "That's the right answer," she said. She got in her truck and drove south. Marin watched her go. She turned back toward the orchard. The afternoon light was doing something specific to the slope in that moment, the angle of it, the way it hit the upper branches of the trees near the ridge, picking out the bud formations on the most advanced trees in a way that was almost architectural. She did not think of it as beautiful, exactly. She thought of it as information. The light was showing her what was there. What was there was an orchard that had been declared dead by everyone who had looked at it. What was there was 41 trees in various stages of a recovery that the county of Bracken Hollow was going to have to look at directly and reckon with. What was there was a woman who had been told in the week after her husband's funeral that the land was going to eat her alive. And the land had not eaten her alive. She had eaten the land's problems instead, consumed them one by one over 11 months. The soil tests and the feed calculations, and the late-night barn checks, and the tax letters, and the back injury and the freeze, and the 6 pigs sold below market, and the $400 loan from Donna, and the countless mornings when she didn't know if it was going to work. She went back inside to do the evening accounts. Tomorrow she would check the blossoms again. The day after tomorrow, and the day after that, if she had to. 3 days after Carol Beaumont drove south, the grandfather tree opened its first blossom. Marin was not standing in front of it when it happened. She was at the east fence restringing a section of wire that had rusted through over winter, and she did not know it had opened until she came through the orchard on her way back to the barn and stopped because something in her peripheral vision registered a change in the tree's silhouette, a small white point, at the tip of the primary bud cluster. Where 3 days ago there had been the papery closed formation she had been watching for weeks. She walked toward it slowly, the way you walk toward something you are afraid of misreading. She was not misreading it. The blossom was open, fully, cleanly, its 5 petals spread in the particular way of an apple flower that has decided it is done waiting. It was small. It was not a spectacular blossom. It had a slight asymmetry on one side where the cold had perhaps affected the development at some stage she hadn't been able to monitor. It was not a perfect thing. It was the most important thing she had seen in a year. She stood in front of the grandfather tree and looked at that single open blossom for a long time. And she did not perform any particular emotion about it because she was alone and there was no one to perform for. And what she actually felt was too layered and too quiet for performance anyway. It was not triumph exactly. It was more like the specific feeling of a door opening that you have been pushing against for so long that when it finally moves, you almost fall through it. She took a photograph. Then she went to the next tree. That tree had 2 blossoms beginning to open, slightly behind the grandfather tree's stage, their petals still cupped, but the white visible at the edges of the formation. The tree after that showed 3 bud clusters with the same degree of opening. By the time she had worked her way through the first 2 rows, it was past noon, and she had documented blossom activity on 11 trees. 11 trees in a dead orchard. She called Ed from the kitchen phone. "They're opening," she said. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "How many trees?" 11 confirmed today. The rest of the 23 are progressing. I'd say 2 more days and I'll have the majority open. "I'm coming out tomorrow," he said. Not a question. "Come for the morning," she said. "The light is better." She called Carol next. Carol answered on the second ring, and Marin said simply, "The grandfather tree opened today. 11 trees total so far." The sound Carol made was not a word. It was the sound of someone who had been holding something in their chest for a long time and had just been given permission to put it down. "I'm coming Saturday," Carol said. "I know," Marin said. She hung up and looked out the kitchen window at the orchard slope. From this distance you could not see the blossoms. The trees were still gray from the road, still bare-looking in the way of an early April that hasn't fully committed. But Marin knew what was in those branches. She had earned the knowledge of it. She made dinner. She ate all of it. She slept 7 hours, which was the most she had slept in a single stretch since October. Ed Forsyth arrived the next morning at 7:30 with a camera that was more serious than hers and a notebook that was already half full of other people's data from other visits. He walked the orchard with her for 2 hours and said very little, which was his way of saying a great deal. He photographed the open blossoms and the progressing bud formations and the soil at multiple points and the root zone exposures where the earthworm activity was visible to the naked eye. He took his own soil temperature readings and noted them without comment. At the grandfather tree he stopped for a long time. He looked at the blossom, now joined by 2 more that had opened overnight, so that the primary cluster held 3 white flowers against the gray bark of a tree that everyone in this county had called dead. And his expression was the expression of a man who has spent decades looking at agricultural data and knows that what he is looking at is not routine. "I want to write a full case study," he said, "not just the soil data, the complete methodology, the timeline, the animal management, the decision-making process. The whole year." "That's a lot of my business to put in print," Marin said. "I know." He looked at her. "It's also the most complete documentation of this methodology that exists in current agricultural literature. The old pamphlet you found is the only comparable record, and it's from the 1940s. He paused. "There are farmers in 6 states who have orchards in the same condition yours was in last March. They need this information." She thought about the farmer in Wisconsin, the one in Pennsylvania, Carol, who was coming Saturday. The question was not really whether to let him write the study. The question was what it meant for her life if she did. The phone calls, the visits, the conversations she would be pulled into, all of it arriving at a time when what she still needed most was to actually run the farm that had produced this result. "Write the study," she said, "but give me until after harvest to do the interviews. I can't be distracted right now." Ed nodded as if this was exactly the answer he'd expected. "Fair," he said. "I'll work from the data we have until August." He left at 10 and she went back to work. By Thursday of that week, 17 trees were in active blossom. By Saturday, when Carol Beaumont drove up the county road and turned into Marin's Drive, the number was 22. 22 trees on a slope that 13 months ago had been so thoroughly written off that a neighbor had come to the property to offer purchase terms before the funeral arrangements were complete. Carol stood at the gate and looked up the slope. She was not alone. She had brought 2 other people. A woman named June, who managed a heritage orchard in the next state over, and a man named Paul, who had driven 6 hours from a property in Wisconsin and who said almost nothing the entire visit, but whose eyes moved over the orchard with the specific focus of someone cataloging every detail because they intend to replicate it. Marin opened the gate and let them in. She walked them through everything. She had not prepared remarks. She had not made it a presentation. She walked the rows the way she always walked them and answered the questions as they came, Carol's precise and technical, June's broader and more experiential, Paul's few and very specific, the kind of questions that told her he had already been thinking about this for months and had arrived with the important uncertainties already identified. At the grandfather tree, Paul finally said more than a sentence. "How close did you come to selling?" he asked. He was looking at the blossoms, not at her. "There was an offer on the table through June of last year," she said, "from the neighbor to the north." "How close?" She thought about it honestly. Close enough that I knew what the number felt like. Not close enough that I ever actually picked up the phone. He nodded slowly. I've got an offer on my table right now, he said, for the orchard parcel. She looked at him. I was in his late 50s, thick-built, with the kind of hands that had been working land for 30 years, and showed it. He looked like a man who had been losing something for long enough that he'd begun to believe the loss was the truth of the situation. How long has the orchard been in decline? She asked. 4 years. Is the land still drainable? You have access to water? Yes to both. And the trees? Have you done cambium checks recently? Some of them are dead, he said. I know that. But some of them, he stopped. Some of them I'm not sure about. Then you're not sure, she said simply. And not sure is not the same as done. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the grandfather tree with its cluster of 3 open blossoms and the pale light coming through them, and said nothing more. He didn't need to. After the group left that afternoon, Marin sat on the porch steps for a while. The visits had taken most of the day, and she still had evening barn checks to do and the weekly accounts to update, and she was tired in the specific way of a person who has spent hours being useful to other people when their own work is waiting. But underneath the tiredness was something else, something she was examining carefully because she did not want to either overstate it or dismiss it. She had spent a year building something with no audience, no one watching, no one recording, no one who believed it was working until the soil tests came back and the cambium showed green and the blossoms opened. She had done it because the alternative was losing something that mattered to her and to Thomas, and to the 41 trees on that slope that were not, it turned out, finished. And now people were coming to her to learn from it. That was a strange thing, not a bad thing, but strange. She had not set out to teach anyone anything. She had set out to save her farm. The fact that the process of saving her farm had produced something worth learning from was not something she had planned, and she was not sure yet how to carry it, whether to carry it at all, or how much of it to pick up, and how much to leave for Ed's case study, and Carol's visits, and whoever else was going to find their way down her drive in the months to come. She didn't have the answer to that yet. She filed it in the same place she filed other things she wasn't ready to decide, somewhere accessible but not urgent, to be returned to when she had the space. She got up and went to do the barn check. The blossom count on the final day of April was 26 trees, 6 more than Carol had come to see, 4 more than Ed had photographed, 1 more than Marin had allowed herself to hope for in the most privately optimistic corner of her thinking. 26 out of 41. It was not a perfect result. 15 trees had not shown meaningful blossom activity, and of those 15 she expected to lose several entirely. The ones whose cambium had stayed brown through every check, the ones whose root systems were too far compromised to respond within a single season of treatment. She had accepted this as the realistic outcome of the methodology as early as June of the previous year. Not all of them were going to make it. The question had never been all of them. The question had been whether enough of them would. 26 was enough. 26 was more than enough. The blossoms gave way to fruit set in May, and Marin watched it happen with the particular attention of someone who has staked everything on a process and is now watching the final stage of that process unfold in real time and in nature's own schedule, which does not consult you and does not hurry. The small green nubs that followed the fallen petals were unprepossessing things, hard and pale and barely visible at the bud sites. But they were present and they were growing, and every morning when she walked the rows and saw another increment of development, she noted it in the notebook with the same care she had given to the soil checks and the cambium readings and the moisture retention data. This was the part nobody saw. The visitors who came in April to look at the blossoms were gone. The phones had quieted. Ed was working on his case study in his office 40 miles away. Carol was back at her own property with the notes she'd taken and the plan she was building. Paul from Wisconsin had driven 6 hours home with whatever he'd decided. It was just Marin and the orchard and the pigs and the daily work. She preferred it this way. The work of May and June was different from the work of the previous year's May and June. Not easier, but differently weighted. She was not managing an experiment anymore. She was managing a farm that was beginning to function the way a farm is supposed to function, which brought its own demands but also its own logic. The pigs were in their second full season of orchard rotation and required less management than the first year because she understood them better and they understood the routine, The soil in the treated sections was stable enough now that she could track its health through monthly spot checks, rather than the intensive daily monitoring of the previous year. The trees were doing what trees do when their conditions are right, growing without her help, which was the whole point. She fixed the tractor in June. Not herself. She was not a mechanic and had made peace with that limitation. She hired a man from Delaware who charged her a rate she negotiated down by 20% by offering to pay in cash that week rather than on account. And the repair took most of a Friday, and when it was done, and she turned the key and the hydraulics responded, she sat in the cab for about 30 seconds and felt the specific satisfaction of a broken thing being functional again. She drove it to the east pasture and did the work she'd been doing by hand since September, and it took 90 minutes instead of 5 hours, and she went back to the barn afterward and stood there in the late afternoon thinking about the economics of time, which is a calculation that farming teaches you whether you want to learn it or not. Every hour is currency. Every working hour costs something and returns something, and the ledger has to come out on the right side often enough, or the whole system fails. Her ledger was coming out better. Not perfectly. Not without strain. The debt was not gone. The creditor balance from the equipment had been reduced but not cleared, and Donna's $400 loan remained in the kitchen drawer with its typed terms, and Roy Carver's account had been brought current but not paid ahead. She was solvent. She was functional. She was by the measure of a farm that 13 months ago had been weeks from forced sale, doing considerably better than anyone in Bracken Hollow had predicted. She made the first payment on Donna's loan in July, 3 months ahead of the schedule they'd agreed to. She called Donna to tell her. "You didn't have to do it early," Donna said. "I know," Marin said. "I wanted to." A pause. "How are the apples looking?" "Small," Marin said, "the way first-year fruit always looks. They're not going to be market perfect, but there are enough of them on enough trees that the harvest is going to be real." "How real?" Marin told her the number she had estimated. The count per tree, multiplied by the trees with active fruit set, adjusted for the attrition that always happened between fruit set and actual harvest. It was a conservative estimate, and Donna would know it was conservative, which was fine. Donna was quiet for a moment. "That's enough to matter." "That's what I thought," Marin said. The summer visitors were different from the spring visitors. The April people had come to see the blossoms, the proof of concept, the visual confirmation of what the soil data had suggested. The summer people came with more specific questions, having had time to read Ed's preliminary data write-up and think about their own situations. A retired county extension agent from 2 states over drove out in July to walk the orchard and talk soil biology with her for 3 hours. A young couple who had recently bought a neglected heritage orchard 40 miles east called and asked if they could visit, and she said yes. And they came and asked the kind of questions that people who are at the beginning of something ask, not the refined technical questions of experienced farmers, who already have most of the framework, but the raw, foundational questions of people who need to understand the whole system before they can trust any of it. She recognized those questions. She had asked them all herself, in the dark, in a dying orchard, in the first weeks after her husband died. The young woman's name was Sarah, and she was about Marin's age, and at one point during the visit she looked at the grandfather tree with its fruit developing in clusters along the lower branches and said, Were you ever just absolutely terrified it wasn't going to work?" Marin looked at her. "Every day," she said. "Most of the day, most days." "How did you keep going?" Marin thought about this honestly, because the young woman deserved an honest answer, and not a clean one. "I kept going because stopping would have required making a different decision," she said, "and I couldn't find a better decision to make. So I kept going with the one I had." Sarah looked at her for a moment. That's not very inspiring." "No," Marin agreed, "but it's true." Sarah's partner laughed at that, a short, genuine laugh. And then Sarah smiled, and it was the smile of someone who has been given something more useful than inspiration. The harvest began in September, not all at once. The orchard gave up its fruit over a 6-week period, as orchards do, the varieties ripening in their own sequence and on their own terms without consulting Marin's schedule or her preferences. She picked what was ready when it was ready, which meant some mornings starting at 6 and not finishing until past dark, and going to bed with her arms tired in a way that was entirely different from the tiredness of the previous year. The previous year's tiredness had been fear wearing a work coat. This year's was just work. The fruit was not uniform. She had expected that. The trees that had recovered more fully produced better fruit, right? Larger, more evenly colored, with the characteristic flavor profiles of the heirloom varieties Thomas's grandfather had planted. The trees that were still in the early stages of recovery produced smaller fruit, some of it misshapen, some of it with the slightly rough texture of apples that didn't have ideal conditions through the full development cycle. She sorted everything carefully and priced accordingly. The premium fruit for direct sale, the secondary fruit for pressing, the culls for composting back into the orchard soil, where they would break down over winter and return nutrients to the ground that had already shown it knew what to do with organic matter. Nothing was wasted. She had 2 buyers approach her in late September. One was a regional produce distributor who had seen Ed's case study in preprint and wanted to establish a relationship with the orchard for the following year. The other was a specialty grocer in the county seat who had heard about the heirloom varieties and wanted to discuss a direct supply arrangement. Both meetings happened at her kitchen table, which was now cleared of the yellow legal pads and the feed calculation sheets because she had moved the ongoing accounts to a proper folder, a small organizational improvement that had taken 12 months of chaos to produce. The distributor was professional and efficient and wanted volume and consistency and a price per bushel that was reasonable but not generous. She told him she would have more volume in the second year and she would be in touch. The specialty grocer was a woman named Iris, who arrived with a notepad and left with a supply agreement for the following season and a box of the best of this year's premium fruit, which Marin threw in without charge because Iris had asked the right questions, and because the relationship mattered more than the cost of one box. She ran the numbers that evening. The harvest revenue, minus the selling costs and the transportation and the storage she'd needed for the pressed fruit, was a number that she held in her head for a moment before she wrote it down. It did not clear all of her debt, but it cleared enough of it that the remaining balance, the reduced creditor payment, the outstanding amount on Donna's loan, the tractor repair she'd charged against the farm account, was now manageable within the following season's projected income without requiring any extraordinary measures. No selling animals below market, no tax deferral applications, no mornings doing feed calculations with a number that made her mouth go dry. She wrote the number down. She stared at it. She was not out of debt. She was not, by any comfortable measure, in an easy financial position. The farm was still difficult, and the work was still relentless, and there were still 11 things broken or deferred or incomplete that she had not yet had the resources or the time to address. But the farm was producing, the orchard was producing, and Marin Whitlock was sitting at her own kitchen table in September looking at a harvest number that the entire county of Bracken Hollow had told her she would never see. She closed the folder. She sat in the kitchen for a while in the quiet, which was a different kind of quiet from the January quiet that pressed on her. This was an evening quiet, the specific stillness of a day that has been fully used. Then she went to tell Harlan. She drove to his property rather than calling, which was a decision she made without entirely examining why she'd made it. She knocked at his door at 7 in the evening, and he answered looking slightly surprised. He had not been expecting company, that was clear. And she said, "The harvest came in. I wanted you to know." He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "Come in," he said. She sat at his kitchen table, which was larger than hers and more organized, the table of a man who had been managing a working farm alone for a long time and had developed his systems. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted one and set them on the table and sat down across from her. She told him the numbers. Not all of them, not the private debt figures, but the harvest volume and the 2 buyer relationships and the state of the orchard going into winter. She told him about the 15 trees that hadn't come back and how she planned to manage that over the next 2 seasons. She told him about Paul from Wisconsin, who had called her in August to say he'd turned down the offer on his orchard parcel and was looking at pigs. Harlan listened. He did not interrupt, which had not always been his way with her in the previous year, and she noticed the difference without pointing at it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need going into winter?" he said. She had not expected the question. She turned it over carefully. "The barn roof needs work. The east section. There's a spot that's been soft since summer, and it won't make it through another hard winter. I've got roofing materials from the repair I did on my equipment shed," he said. "Left over. You can have them." She looked at him. "I'm not doing you a favor," he said, in the tone she recognized from Roy Carver offering the discounted grain. "I've got materials sitting in a shed doing nothing." "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. They drank the coffee. It was not a comfortable silence, and it was not an uncomfortable one. It was the silence of two people who have been in an adversarial position and have arrived, through a year of evidence, at something different. Not friendship exactly, something more like mutual recognition. The acknowledgement that each of them had been more than the other had initially assessed. She drove home in the dark. October moved through the farm quickly, the way October does when you are not dreading what comes next. She prepared the pigs for their second winter in the barn with the efficiency of someone who has done it before and knows what the mistakes are. She winterized the orchard rows with the mulching and the soil amendment she'd planned since August. She took the October soil tests and sent them to Ed. And when his analysis came back showing that the biological indicators had improved further, the nitrogen levels, the pH, the compaction measurements, she filed the results with the previous year's data and did not feel the need to tell anyone immediately. She would tell people when the telling was useful. Right now the data was hers, and it was enough to know it. Donna came for a weekend in November. They did not talk about the farm much, which was itself a change from every visit since Thomas died, when the farm had been the only thing either of them could think about, because it was the thing most likely to collapse. They talked about Donna's work and about a book Maren had read in September, and about Thomas, actually about him, about specific memories, the kind of conversation that requires enough distance from grief to sit in it without drowning. On the last evening, Donna said, "He would have done this differently." "Probably," Maren said, "but he wouldn't have done it better." Maren looked at her sister-in-law across the kitchen table. "No," she said after a moment, "I don't think he would have." It was the most she had allowed herself on the subject of her own competence in relation to Thomas's, and she noticed it cost her something to say it, and also that saying it was right. Thomas had been a gifted farmer, and she had loved him, and she had learned most of what she knew about this land from him. And she had taken what he taught her and done something with it that he might not have thought to do, or might not have been willing to risk, or might have executed differently in ways she would never know. That was the real thing she had to carry. Not just the farm, not just the orchard, but the fact that she had found out, in the worst year of her life, who she was when the situation removed every comfortable assumption and left her with just the problem and her own capacity for solving it. She was someone who solved it. That was not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. It came with responsibility that you could not put down and could not delegate. If you were the person who could figure it out, you were also the person who had to figure it out. And there was no timeline on that, no point at which it concluded, no spring blossoming that meant you were done. She had known this, in some way, since March of the previous year. What she understood now, in a November kitchen with Donna's coffee cup on the table and the farm accounts showing numbers that would have been unimaginable 14 months ago, was that she did not mind. She did not mind being that person. She had spent part of her life worrying about whether she was enough for the demands that came at her, whether her body was acceptable, whether her knowledge was adequate, whether her judgment could be trusted, whether the county of Bracken Hollow was right about what she could and could not handle. She had carried those worries alongside the grief and the fear and the financial pressure and the physical relentlessness of the year, and they had been heavy. At some point, she couldn't have identified the exact moment, they had gotten lighter. Not gone. She was not the kind of person who pretended things were gone when they were just quieter, but lighter. The way a carried weight gets lighter, not because you put it down, but because you get stronger, and the ratio changes. And one day you realize you're not thinking about the weight anymore because you've been busy doing the actual work. The second spring came. She planted 6 new trees on the orchard's western edge, heritage varieties from a nursery Ed had recommended, selected for compatibility with the specific soil conditions she had now documented in detail. Not all of them would take. She expected to lose 2, possibly 3, and she had priced that into her plan and chosen not to be upset about it in advance. She put the pigs back in the orchard in April, their 3rd season on that slope. She walked the rows on the first warm morning and checked the trees, the 26 that had blossomed the previous year, now carrying the additional development of a second full season of improved soil conditions, their bud sites more abundant and the bud formation stronger than anything she had seen in year 1. And the 15 that had not come back the previous year. She checked those too, without expectation, because checking was what you did, and because not sure was still not the same as done. She found green cambium in 2 of the 15. 2 trees that had not responded in the first year were responding now, in the second, because the root conditions had continued to improve through the winter and the spring had found something in them that the previous spring had not. She stood in the orchard with her knife and her notebook and her hand that was still not entirely steady when she encountered something she hadn't anticipated, and she noted the 2 trees in the notebook and kept moving. By the time the blossoms came that year, fuller and earlier, and across 31 trees, she had learned to receive good news the way she received everything, as information, not as resolution. Good news was not the end of the problem. It was the confirmation that the work was producing what the work was supposed to produce, and that meant you kept doing the work, with whatever adjustments the situation required. She kept doing the work. Paul from Wisconsin called in June of the second year. He had put 40 pigs in his orchard in March, and was seeing early soil response and wanted to talk through the rotation schedule. She talked to him for 40 minutes on a Tuesday evening and answered every question she could and told him the ones she couldn't answer and gave him Ed Forsyth's number for the ones that needed a soil scientist. He called back in October to say his cambium checks were showing green in 11 trees. She said, "That's something." He said, "It's more than something." She said, "Yes, it is." Ed's full case study was published in February of the second year in the Midwest Agricultural Review, the same journal that had run the preliminary data piece, but this time longer, more detailed, with the complete 18-month data set and the second season preliminary results included. It was not a dramatic publication. It was a careful, methodical scientific document. It had her name on it as co-author because Ed had insisted and she had eventually agreed. 3 weeks after it was published, she received a letter, a physical letter, handwritten, which was unusual enough that she opened it standing at the mailbox before walking back to the house. It was from a woman in her 70s who farmed a small heritage orchard in Vermont, and the letter said, in handwriting that covered 3 pages in a small, precise script, "I have been trying to bring my orchard back for 8 years. I had given up. Your case study made me think I might not have to. I am 73 years old, and I still have time to try this. Thank you for documenting what you did so that people like me could find it." Marin read the letter twice. She went inside and set it on the kitchen table and made coffee and stood at the window looking at the orchard slope in the February gray. She thought about the 1940s pamphlet with Thomas's name penciled inside the front cover. She thought about the farmer who had written that pamphlet, had sat down and documented a methodology that probably seemed obscure and marginal in its own time, something not many people would read, something that might not matter to very many people for very many years. It had mattered to one person in a farmhouse in Bracken Hollow, on a winter night 60 or 70 years later. And now she had written something that mattered to a woman in Vermont who was 73 years old and still had time to try. That was how things moved forward, she thought. Not in the clean arcs that stories told about themselves, not in single moments of triumph that resolved everything cleanly and left everyone better off without remainder, but in the slow, passed-along way that useful knowledge travels, from one person's specific problem to the record they made of how they solved it, to the next person's specific problem, to the next record. She was part of that chain now. She had not chosen to be. She had chosen to save her farm. The chain had claimed her as a consequence. The coffee was ready. She poured it and drank it and wrote a letter back to the woman in Vermont, which took her 3 drafts and an hour to get right, because she wanted it to be honest and not inspiring, useful and not heroic, the kind of letter that gives someone what they actually need rather than what they want to feel. She told the woman the things that mattered: the stocking density per acre, the rotation schedule, the cambium check method, the soil testing timeline. She told her that the first year would be hard and the second year would be clearer, and that some of the trees would not come back, and that was not failure, that was information. She told her to find her county extension agent and get baseline soil tests done before she put a single animal on the ground. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "The orchard is not the same thing as the land. The land is what you keep. The orchard is what the land is capable of, given the right conditions and enough time. Your job is to create the conditions. The orchard will do the rest." She sealed the envelope and put it on the table to mail the next day. Then she put on her coat and her boots, the good pair now, the ones she'd bought in November to replace the ones that had been damp every morning for a year. And she walked out into the February afternoon and through the gate and up the slope into the orchard. The trees were dormant, The pigs were in the barn. The ground was dark and cold and held in its transformed composition, the record of everything she had done and everything she had survived, and everything she had been forced to become in the 18 months since a man had walked through her gate and looked at her body and told her this land was going to eat her alive. She walked to the grandfather tree. 3 growing seasons in, it was different. The bark looked the same, gray, rough, furrowed in the particular way of old apple trees that have been through things. But the structure of it was different if you knew how to look. The crown had filled in ways that indicated genuine root activity sustaining it. The branch architecture was healthy. The bud sites were dense with the formations that would open in April. She put her hand on the trunk. She had done this before. In March, in the dark, deciding. In December, when the first bud cracked open. In April, when the first blossom opened. Now in February, in the quiet, in the cold, with nothing to prove and no one watching and no decision pending. Just her hand on the bark of a tree that was alive. She stood there for a while. The farm was still difficult. The work was still relentless. The debt was reduced but not finished, and the tractor needed its filters changed, and the east fence was going to need another section replaced in the spring, and 42 pigs were going to wake up in the barn tomorrow and require exactly what they required, as they had every day for going on 2 years. Thomas was still gone. None of that had changed. Grief doesn't resolve the way problems resolve. It becomes something you carry differently, the way the feed weight had become something she carried differently. Not lighter because the weight changed, but lighter because she had. The shape of his absence was as specific as it had ever been. She knew the exact dimensions of it. She had learned to move through her days with it the way you learn to move through a familiar room in the dark. Carefully. Not because you're afraid, but because care is simply what the situation requires, and you have gotten good at that. She took her hand off the tree. She turned around and looked down the slope at the farmhouse. The kitchen window lit from inside where she'd left the light on. The barn roof repaired with Harlan's materials. The drive where Thomas had painted the name on the board above the gate that still said Whitlock's Rest. The county of Bracken Hollow had written her ending 13 months ago. She had written a different one, not a perfect one, not a clean one. Not the one where everything was restored and the debt was gone and the farm was easy and the grief had finished. The one where she was still here and the orchard was alive and the work continued and the land that she and Thomas had dreamed about together was still, stubbornly, irreducibly hers. She walked back down the slope. There was a barn check to do before dark.